Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I am your host, Riley Lewis. As always, we have a lot to cover, so let's just jump right into it. Now, I'm going to talk about a few different things, some of them cultural, some of them about the coronavirus. We'll start with the coronavirus. So, yesterday morning, Dr. Anthony Fauci was joined by several senior-ranking health officials and certain people such as Dr. Robert Redfield, who is the director of the CDC, and Stephen Hahn, who is the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, to basically testify before the Senate on what we've seen in basically the coronavirus response so far, any progress we've made, things that we still need to improve on, which they talked about certainly quite a bit, and then also where the United States is comparatively with Europe and other places. So again, this testimony took place on the Senate floor yesterday morning with a very limited number of people, really just a few senators, and then Dr. Anthony Fauci, Dr. Redfield, Stephen Hahn, and some others. And this Senate hearing really does come amid a very large spike in the number of reported coronavirus cases in the United States and the world. Now, this really isn't surprising because the United States and the rest of the world has recently experienced 3 to 4 weeks of fairly large protests that were very, very persistent, and that is likely, at least in part, responsible for what's going on. And we can't know that because, at least in certain cities in this country, health officials and doctors, workers, people on the front lines are being told and have been instructed that they are not allowed to ask people whether or not they've been to a protest or a demonstration in honor of obviously what's going on after the brutal murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. But the point is, we're not even allowed to track those figures, so it's really impossible to know how much of this is related to that, how much of this is related to other irresponsible behavior, basically, because that's really what's going on here. We're still in the middle of a pandemic, and I don't want to be insensitive to people's political causes and to justice. But also we have to be smart and realize that we're still in the middle of a pandemic with a virus that is increasingly seeming like it may have been created in a lab in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And this is a virus that, based on some of the things that Brett Weinstein has said, is incredibly aggressive in some ways and also unpredictable in some other ways. And that's really scary. The point is, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, so large gatherings of any kind aren't a good idea. But people really, frankly, for a few weeks kind of threw that out the window because there was just a lot of, raw emotion coming up as some brutal tragedies were experienced. Now, as you may recall, I have mentioned in previous episodes that one of the casualties in this coronavirus lockdown has been the closure of schools and school districts. And school districts nationwide have been really, really hit absolutely hard. This has been a hurricane of terribleness for many school districts that have had to lay off maybe 50, 60, 70% of their staff. Students who are not able to go to school anymore, who depend on federal programs for hot meals, for example, kids who just don't learn as well at their home environment, students who maybe don't have a safe home environment. This has been detrimental for teachers, for faculty, for students, and for parents who now have to be teachers and babysitters and tutors themselves. So, as I'm saying, parents, many of whom, maybe single parents, maybe parents in any case that are both working, or you're a single parent and you're working, these parents are really strained as they attempt now to be providers, workers, parents, babysitters, school teachers, and after-school guidance counselors. It's really a lot. And all of this in addition to the stress and confusion of just the coronavirus writ large, the rest of the country is deciding to reopen. And in other words, I don't think that we can stay locked down forever. We certainly learned, I think, with this stimulus program that most people simply, especially essential workers, cannot afford to just take a 4-month-long vacation and in return receive one check for $1,200. It's not possible. And in the month of April alone, 20 million people filed for unemployment. 20 million people alone in the month of April. So that's not sustainable. So I really think that at this point, in some ways, we have to reopen. I don't think it's an option. So now it's about, how do we reopen safely? How do we do it safely? Now, some states have done it more safely than others. And this worked for a while, by the way. Texas opened and started easing restrictions May 1st. We're not talking about this until the end of June, 8 weeks later. So it worked for at least some time, but at the end of May, George Floyd was killed May 25th by Officer Derek Chauvin, as I've mentioned in previous episodes. And when that tragedy took place, people took to the streets in large numbers, and I understand. But I also understand that there are consequences for our actions. And one of the consequences may be an increase in the rise of coronavirus cases. That said, some of the important things that were mentioned during the Senate hearing, one of which was mentioned by Dr. Redfield, is that we are really ramping up our testing. And in recent weeks, we've been testing as many as 500,000 people a day. And Dr. Redfield would like to see that go up to 1 million people a day. So in part, this is also about the fact that we're discovering new cases because we're testing so many more people, which we should have been doing since March. We should have been doing this since day one, testing as many people as we can, as quickly as we can. So this is a really good thing. However, I also don't want to cover up for the fact that we are seeing a rise in cases nationwide, certainly due to reckless behavior, especially on the part of young people. Young people who think, well, even if we get it, or we've probably had it, or if we get it, we're going to survive it. So frankly, there are a lot of young people, especially here in this country, that do think that way. Some of my friends, and that's how they think. And that is not great for preventing the spread of the virus. So I certainly know that a lot of this is also just due to reckless behavior of all kinds. And no one wants to admit that their behavior is reckless because they feel like they have a reasonable justification. I'm young, I'm not going to get it, or I'll survive it, or whatever. But it's not just about you, it's about everybody. And we really have this. I think this coronavirus has been a very interesting stress test for the individual versus the collective mindset in America, because I think that sometimes we do focus too much on the individual and not on the collective. Don't get me wrong, 10 out of 10 times I will side in defense of civil liberties and my constitutional rights, but also I care about the health of the community. So, and I don't think that that's unreasonable. Now, let's get into some specific numbers here. According to the Washington Post, the number of detected coronavirus cases globally now is estimated at 10.3 million, which is a lot. Now, of those 10 million cases, 2.6 million of them have been in the United States. Now, we've also reached, again, approximately, or I haven't mentioned this yet, but we've reached approximately 500,000 deaths from COVID in the world now, of which 124,000 or more of those deaths are right here in the United States. Now, without diving into the ways in which we count COVID cases and all the politics surrounding COVID, because that's really talked about. I want to stay with this article, which is really about the Senate hearing and how we can do better and what we can improve on. And so one of the key points that was made by Democrats and Republicans alike that I found interesting was really a call on civilians to start wearing facial coverings more often, with more frequency, more precision, and really even in public and private. There was just a very strong bipartisan wave of sentiment that said that people in this country really do need to know that masks work. We were originally told masks do not work because they did not want Americans to create a shortage of personal protective equipment, PPE, but we know now that masks do work, and we really do need to be wearing masks. And despite the confusion in the start of this, which I really think is responsible in large part for the confusion we're seeing now in the elevation in the number of cases, I really do think that our entire course would have been different if Americans knew that it was important to wear a mask unequivocally. And now that we do, it's important to see both our parties, Democrats and Republicans, advocate to the American people, because I think that will be emblematic to the people that there really is something that's going on that is not just some conspiratorial deep state, nonsense. It's something that's very real, and it's something that has bipartisan support. Traditionally in this country, things that have bipartisan support are very popular, and it's because there are enough people on both sides that support it. And I think that we really need to abandon the politics that have overcome the whole coronavirus incident and really just return to the science and the facts. If we want to prevent the spread and choke off the virus, then we need to wear masks. It's one of the little minor things that we can all do, and if we all do it together, it will have a monumental impact. And we've seen this in Europe, which they did mention yesterday in the Senate hearing, which I encourage you to watch online on YouTube. I'm sure it was streamed by CNN, by C-SPAN. I watched it live on Twitter, or I'm sorry, on the New York Times. But in any case, there are various places around the world, such as the EU, where they are thinking about reopening. And they're not really thinking about including the United States because they're worried about coronavirus cases. So if we really do want to make sure that we don't turn this into an even bigger tragedy, we need to start doing things like just wearing masks, personal hygiene, really actually respecting that things that seem silly actually do go a long way if we all do them together. Now, some of the other meaningful takeaways that I really want to mention that came from the Senate again yesterday morning. These were written up in the Washington Post, so these are not mine. Again, these came from the Washington Post, but these are some of the other just bullet points that I think that you guys should know about that are really important that came from the Senate hearing. Now, one of them, the first one, Anthony Fauci, and again, Dr. Fauci, the nation's top infectious diseases expert, gave a warning yesterday morning, in a Senate committee hearing held as the coronavirus infections surge in many parts of the U.S. Quote, "We are now having 40,000+ new cases a day. I would not be surprised if we got up to 100,000 a day if this does not turn around. And so I am very concerned." That's something that Fauci said to Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts about the future of the overall U.S. death toll, which is, again, the predictions originally were that this thing would be much worse, but then we locked down and then it wasn't, but maybe that's because the lockdown measures worked. Now we're seeing a spike in cases reportedly. Maybe that's because we were acting pretty recklessly, across the board there for a few weeks, toward the end of May into June, regardless of demonstrations or just going to the beach or hanging out with your friends. So, all of these things are really important to talk about. But that said, so I think the thing is we just have to think critically here and realize that this is very, very important, and that could happen. But also, number one, the first time the predictions came around, the results were not nearly as bad. But also, we have control in this. We are a variable in this equation, and we can make it so that through our actions, we slow the spread and choke off the virus. So those numbers don't have to come true if we decide to behave differently. So that's really the thing that the media we leave out, that I want to add, is that if we just behave differently, then those numbers don't have to be, they act like they're set in stone. Those numbers don't have to happen at all if we just act responsibly. Now, one of the other points from the Washington Post. Alabama, Florida, Montana, Nevada, North Carolina, and Oklahoma, and I would add California is on that list for sure, have reported 7-day new coronavirus cases, rolling average highs, continuing a 21-day streak nationally, according to data tracked by the Washington Post. Another bullet point, the stimulus program that has both infuriated and sustained U.S. small business owners since its launch in April is now set to close with more than $130 billion left unused, prompting lawmakers to consider how to repurpose the money for still ailing the economy. Now, another interesting one. More Republican leaders advocated for the use of face masks and face coverings in public, including the House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, a Republican from California, who encouraged the President and the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to both wear masks in public. Another point, the Food and Drug Administration said that to win regulatory approval, any COVID-19 vaccine will have to prevent the disease or decrease its severity in at least 50% of the people who receive it, which is very interesting. By the way, if you're wondering what the threshold is for herd immunity, Dr. Redfield said 70%, Dr. Fauci said 70% at the very least, but preferably closer to 80 or 85% to reach herd immunity. Now, the final point, while the United States wrestles with safely reopening, the European Union confirmed Americans will not be allowed to travel to the bloc of 27 countries when it opens to some foreign travel on Wednesday, which is today. Now, moving on in Other news today that's important: Reddit has finally taken a stance here in the culture wars as they decide to ban well over 2,000 different subreddit communities due to new content policy updates. This is being reported on by The Verge, where the popular social media platform Reddit, which has been along for quite some time, has updated their content policy, which resulted in the removal of well over 2,000 subreddit communities. In a move that, again, clearly is positional about the First Amendment and the culture war, the company decided to officially ban what they call hate speech, and what we hear is commonly called hate speech. Of course, I mean, one part of me, I should say, I do really respect and admire trying to create a more friendly, more caring world, but I also know that historically hate speech has been a term that's just been used to silence political dissidents or people who disagree with political mainstream dogma, and I think that that's what's going on here. And by the way, some of these popular subreddit channels include r/the Donald and the Chapo Trap House. Chapo being a reform of the word chop, which was a twist from the original name Chaz for the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, where a bunch of protesters set up their own city, putting up walls, checking people's IDs in the middle of Seattle, and the city of Seattle did nothing, and this happened. I'd like to add that if a bunch of right-wingers literally took over a city and put up walls and started checking people's IDs, this would make the headlines, the front page of the New York Times for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. So I do think it's interesting that some people can do this, and because they're not on the right, the media just covers for it, and it's totally acceptable. It's acceptable behavior. We give it a pass. I really can't believe it. But in any case, this move from Reddit, I do think, comes amid tons of pressure, obviously, from a lot of citizens who are very concerned about some of the things that they see online. And I honestly think that we've reached a point where people literally want to live in a world where they never have to hear something that they disagree with or they don't want to hear. They never want to hear someone else's perspective unless it's exactly what they think. We want to create this echo chamber world, and this is part of the purging process. That means we have to purge all diversity. There are no voices that can be conflicting or have different ideas. It has to be just one voice, one idea, one ideology all the time in every direction on every single social media platform. Facebook, Twitter, and now Reddit. We're seeing this even with Xbox and video game consoles. I mean, it's everywhere. So clearly we're really starting to shift away from valuing the First Amendment, which, by the way, was fought very hard for, especially in the 1960s, and many grassroots movements who, fought for freedom of speech and wanted to, expose things like scandals such as Watergate. But now we've moved away from that, and we've moved closer to silencing speech because we just don't want to live in a world where we have to hear speech that we don't agree with, which really is quite sad, by the way. I think it is really terribly sad. But in any case, I just think that some of the foundational elements of the revolution that we're seeing right now are just inherently so destructive, and that when we're really living with the consequences of that destructive nature. This revolution, unlike the American and the French Revolution in many ways, does not have some intellectual enlightenment behind it, or philosophical enlightenment behind it. It's just outrage. It's just an appetite for destruction. And it's really quite saddening. In any case, Reddit has decided again to remove over 2,000 communities from their platform following weeks of protests, including virtual blackouts from various subreddits on their own website. Now, Reddit, again, has been widely criticized in the past for their lax stance, if you will, which really, when you hear people say in the media lax stance, it means they like the First Amendment. They just support freedom of speech. And sometimes, for example, here's an example. I call you up on the phone, and you say something like, I want to go hurt somebody. That doesn't mean that we can sue Verizon because two people who have cell phones said things that violated, some sort of code of conduct over the phone. The responsibility is on us, not the people who make the phone. So people in the comment section on Facebook should be responsible for their own comments. Facebook should not be responsible for those comments. But that's where we're shifting the responsibility to. And so that's what's going on. And I really do think, again, that people in the media especially struggle to separate this idea of actually supporting the First Amendment and what it actually means with support or advocacy for all people who speak. I don't condone everything that is said by everybody. In fact, there are a lot of things that people say that offend me. But I would, in the old days of the ACLU, in their old motto, I would rather fight for your ability to speak your mind than not let you speak your mind at all, because that's that's a foundational element of a democracy. So at this point, I don't even know if we're living in a democracy anymore. And again, I really do want to make this point that even the ACLU has shifted on this. Their former creed really was to defend the right to freedom of speech, regardless of how they felt about the speech itself, because the right is what's important there. It's the right, and in the marketplace of ideas, we will not condone bad ideas like racism, prejudice, sexism, and we will condone good ideas like inclusivity and diversity. You would hope. Now, to be fair, this really was not an easy decision for the company. They've been fighting this kind of social pressure for years and years and years, and I really do have a great deal of respect for the CEO of Reddit, Steve Huffman. Now, Huffman had this to say about the decision, quote, "I have to admit that I've struggled with balancing my values as an American and around free speech and free expression with my values and the company's values around common human decency, which I think is really fair, and I think that is exactly what's going on here. I think more crassly speaking, or I guess more frankly speaking, I think that really what we're seeing is that people are literally starting to bully companies into silencing certain voices with certain political persuasions or certain points that they want to make because people want to live in this bubble world where they never have to hear anything that they don't want to hear. But in any case, I do think that this is a powerful statement, and I would like to add that this sentiment really should be applied universally. Meaning, I'll see people like even certain celebrities, not certain, I mean, I have seen certain celebrities do terrible things on Twitter and say terrible things on Twitter and get away with it, but other celebrities who have different opinions, who have different political perspectives, be completely silenced. So clearly, these codes of conduct are really only being applied to one side of the aisle. And I will let you try to determine what I'm hinting at, but one side of the aisle is being completely promoted all the time. They're allowed to make death threats, but the other side of the aisle is not allowed to do that at all. It's considered hate speech, and they need to be silenced and erased and blocked. In many cases banned or shadow banned. And we've even seen this with independent journalists such as Tim Pool, who've tried to report on the coronavirus but are not, quote, an authoritative source in the eyes of YouTube. So we're seeing an interesting monopoly over the bottleneck that controls the flow of information. That's really what's going on. And one of my bigger concerns with social media platforms and the First Amendment generally is that, again, inflammatory language is usually flagged only if it comes from one side of the political spectrum, but it's rarely an issue for our friends on the other side of the political spectrum. And it's very frustrating to see people in the mainstream media, even celebrities, make death threats about kids, about the president, about his voters, and Twitter doesn't say a word, but then the president says something about enforcing laws that are on the books if people decide to set up their own autonomous zone and literally secede from their own state, and Twitter bans it. You're not allowed to say that we are going to enforce laws that are on the books as the commander-in-chief, but you are allowed to make death threats at kids if you have the same political philosophies as the people that create and run the website or platform that you're on. Does this sound like a democracy to you? This doesn't sound like a democracy to me. Please let me know what you guys think of the feedback, but I don't think any of this is a democracy. But in any case, let's just go over this new policy. According to The Verge, which states the following, quote, "Remember the human. Reddit is a place for creating community and belonging, not for attacking marginalized or vulnerable groups of people." That's super ironic. "Everyone has a right to use Reddit free of harassment, bullying, and threats of violence, unless we don't like your political ideas. Communities and people that incite violence or that promote hate based on identity or vulnerability will be banned." Now, obviously, I agree with the idea that we should be promoting inclusivity, but that literally means inclusivity. that does not mean inclusivity unless you disagree with us about taxes or social policy, and then that means you don't get to use our platform. So I just want us to really start thinking, what does inclusivity and diversity, what do these two terms really mean? Because really what they mean is that you have to coexist and find a way to tolerate with things even if you don't agree with it or like it. And even for me, I read things all the time that I think are mean-spirited, inflammatory, maybe bigoted or prejudiced, racist, and it offends me. But I would rather have someone speak that idea and then have me freely speak and say I think those ideas are bad ideas, and then let the court of public opinion side with, the non-racists and say that's just a bad idea, and let the sunlight be the best disinfectant. But instead, we're creating a bubble wrap world where you don't have to touch sharp edges, and we're just saying basically we don't want to figure out how to deal with weird feelings and conflict online. So let's just prevent conflict by saying a bunch of people who think certain ways aren't allowed to use it, period. How about that? And it really just is starting to pull the fabric of our nation apart by the seams. And we're saying this with other social media platforms, as I mentioned earlier. By the way, there are a list now of companies that are pulling their ads from Facebook, basically because there's been a lot of public outrage that has surfaced in recent weeks about the company's very lax behavior regarding hate speech, which again, Facebook does not promote hate speech. It's a social media platform. Billions of people are on it. Sometimes people say terrible things, but also think about this. Sometimes people call each other up on the phone and they say terrible things, but we don't go sue Verizon. Sometimes people get in a car together and they say terrible jokes, but we don't sue Ford or Toyota. So why would we sue Facebook because someone in a comment section is making terrible comments? If someone in the comment section makes a bad comment, the only person that should be responsible for that is the person that made the comment, not the platform that it happens on. I mean, should we start suing concrete when races get together because they're standing on concrete and the concrete's literally propping them up? Like, I just think that this is so silly. And as Eric Weinstein puts it, we are officially riding the wake of the woke. We are riding the wake of the woke, right into this weird bubble world that is going to just create so much more tension, because I mean we're going to start resegregating based on political ideology, and it's really scary. But I literally see my friends online only associating, gradually starting to only associate with people that agree with them and not associate with people that think differently than they do. And even not even just I want to even make this about arguments about agreeing or disagreeing. I don't want that dichotomy to determine the trajectory of our conversations. I'm just saying that I thought that the whole point of freedom of speech and association and restoring constitutional rights in the movements of the 1960s was so that we could live in a better world where we actually do include people. And that means that those of us who have the righteous ideas, we're supposed to prosper and condemn those who have the bad ideas. But even, as the ACLU once said, fighting for people's right to speak, because rights that are taken away are seldom returned. So it's about your ability to speak your mind freely without restriction from the government, even if I don't agree with the terrible things that someone might be saying. And that doesn't mean I'm condoning someone's behavior. It means I'm standing by a right, an obligation that the government cannot interfere. And by the way, that's one of the things that makes this place very special, because in many places around the world, one of the things that the government puts into place is sedition acts. So in the United States, we have freedom of speech, meaning you can be incredibly critical of the government. You can be incredibly critical of the president, which many, many, many people are online all day long, posting their social slogans and their various causes and their criticisms of the president. And that's all fine and well. Why? Because I believe in freedom of speech. People should be able to speak their minds. And if you're happy, then say why you're happy. And if you're not happy, then say why you're not happy. But the whole point is I stand by that right. And I want to leave today's episode with Eric Weinstein's idea of riding the wake of the woke into this very weird new age world where we're just running away from the idea of conflict because we just can't handle it. Thank you, everybody, for listening to today's episode of The Riley Lewis Show. If you'd like to find me and more of my content, again, I'm available right here on YouTube. I'm also available on Breaker. I'm available on Anchor.fm. I'm available on Spotify. I'm available on Google Podcasts. And I'm available on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to support me even further, you can hit that subscribe button down below. I'd really appreciate it. Right here, you'll find some of my playlists for my daily politics podcast, where you can go binge watch and catch up on some of the recent current events going on with a fresh new twist from me, yours truly. Additionally, you can visit the link in the description of this video to my Patreon page, where you can sign up, become a member, and make a donation. Or you can go to my Anchor page, that's again in the web browser or on your mobile app on the smartphone. You can go ahead and go to my Anchor page at The Riley Lewis Show, and you can donate to my virtual wallet. In any case, I look forward to meeting again sometime in the future. You've been listening to The Riley Lewis Show.